Hello, welcome to this next Marvelous Designer tutorial. I thought it might be interesting to have a look at the cloth properties a little bit more closely. I've looked at them in terms of presets, you know, from the fabrics directory. Sorry about the external noise, I've got my window open because it's warm. Well, warm for me anyway. Sorry about that. Anyway, so what was I saying? So fabrics then, so we've got all these different presets down here and we can apply those and they'll do things. But you know, what actually drives those, you know, what makes them work? So I'm just going to draw out a little rectangle. Let's just click in and click OK. Well, I've got a little cube in my scene and I'm just going to maneuver this so that I'm somewhere near it. There we go. And then I'm just going to pin the pin box a couple of the corners, and then if I activate the simulation I'll get a little drape, and I can select each of these pins and move them about while the sim's running, and I just want them to kind of drape along that box and perhaps move them down a little bit to get a little bit more of an interesting effect, or folding effect rather. There we go, somewhat along those lines anyway, perhaps a little further back just to let it drag and drape. Come on, select, you little swine. There you go. Okay, so to further give us a little bit more on this, I'm going to increase my particle distance, or rather decrease it to 10, and that will give me a little more in the way of geometry to work with. There we go. So on our default fabric, and I'm using this default here, default V5.2, just going to drag and drop that to make sure I'm reset to the normal. You see, this is what we get. This is kind of a default neutrally kind of fabric, I guess, which doesn't really do an awful lot. We've got some folds and we've got some bits and bobs, but not a lot else. So if we sort of drag, say, cotton onto it, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's delete unused. Let's drag cotton onto our default there. There we go. You'll see it changes the way it behaves. And if I drag something suitably different onto there, like fur, it will behave differently again. But yeah, some of them can be quite subtle between them. So you have to have kind of a look around. So what drives these? Let me reset this first to the default. So underneath your property editor for the fabric, you'll see the preset, and if you open that up you'll get all these lovely little sliders that we can work with, and each of these, or each of these does a different thing. Some of them are kind of grouped together, but others are a bit more independent. So in the next couple of sections, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the groupings as I see them, from my technical point of view, not from the fact that I know what fabric is. Well, I know what it is, but you know how it works is slightly more of a mystery. So we'll go through them, and the first one we'll go through is the stretch weft and stretch warp and the shear. So I'll talk to you in the next section. Okay, so I'm just going to drag and drop my material back on there to make sure it's reset, and then we can start again. So now we're looking at stretch weft, stretch warp and shear. So the stretch is basically how much is this going to stretch, you know, either under gravity or under, you know, tension on the on your model. So the lower values will stretch more, which might seem counterintuitive, but it is stretch resistance, if you like, and the higher values will stretch much less. If you think about it in 3D terms, you know, each polygon has vertices, and the lower the value, the more it will allow those vertices to spread out and make the polygon bigger, and the higher the value, the more it will try and keep those vertices to the same scale and shape. Okay, so let's see if we can demonstrate this. So my sim's on, and if I take stretch weft and turn it down, you'll see it's stretching much more. It's sort of collapsing under its own weight and stretching, and you know, you're getting a different kind of effect. And if I turn these values up much higher, there we go, you'll see that it tries to maintain its shape. Yeah, it can go a little mad if you whip those dials around too hard. And yeah, now it's trying to maintain its shape. It is changing, it is, you know, collapsing and, you know, draping as material does, but it's trying to keep the same size of polygon for each polygon. I hope that makes sense. Now the third one is the shear, and the shear is it's the same, it's the stretch resistance, but it's in an X. I've got a little cheat sheet here that I made for myself, feel free to screenshot it. So bias is sort of like diagonally and across, you know, on your garment, whereas warp is up and weft is left to right. Well, up, down and left to right for weft. So the shear is still stretch resistance, and the value model is the same. So if I raise this, you'll see it starts to stiffen up, but I would caution going too mad on the shear, because if you go right to the very bottom, you'll find it has a tendency to collapse a little bit too much. Now I've got a lot of stretch weft and stretch warp on this. If I start to reduce these values, you'll see that we get it really collapsing. Now if you want that effect, then that's how to do it. But you know, it seems a little bit extreme to me. Also, if you go right to the very top, you know, you'll get a similar effect. It will really try and hold its shape, and especially if I do the same for the warp and the weft. I think I may have pushed it a little bit too far there. You'll see it's now, you know, just trying to maintain its shape in all directions, which isn't necessarily going to work very well for us. Yeah, see, it's getting very springy now, but only in that it's trying to maintain its own shape. So let me reset this. So if I drag and drop my material back on there, see, it should go back to normal. So stretching is, you know, how much will your garment stretch. You know, if you have low values, it will stretch a lot. If you have high values, it will hardly stretch at all. So if you imagine, I can imagine that, like what's that stuff joggers wear and cyclists, spandex. You know, spandex is very stretchy, so it'd be a kind of low value, whereas leather is very stiff and doesn't stretch hardly at all, so it'd be a very high value. Okay, so next we'll go on to the bending options, so I shall talk to you then. Okay, so the bending parameters, so let's have a look at my cheat sheet. So we've got bending weft, warp and bias, so left to right, up and down and on the X. And it's, again, it's resistance, because lower values bend more and higher values bend less. So let's have a look at that in practice. So here's my garment, and let's just make sure I've reset it. I have. So if I reduce the bending weft, it will start to bend more in the horizontal. If I reduce the bending warp, it will start to bend more in the vertical. And if I reduce the bending bias, it will start to bend more in the the diagonal cross. Now that wasn't very visible there, but it will be more visible if I go to higher values. So bending weft, let's put it up to somewhere around I don't know, 50-ish, and similarly for the warp. And there you can see that it's a much stiffer material, much more, you know, leathery or kind of tarpaulin-y plastic. You know, it's hitting and bending, but it's not actually forming a lot of detail. So if I reduce those now, we can see as I reduce them, it's bending much more readily. I might need to just pop these down a little bit, or perhaps leave one up and one down. Might give us a more interesting look. There we go. Let's try that again. So if I go back to the material, so I'm going to increase my bending warp and weft. Let's go up even higher now, and the higher you go, the stiffer it will become, to the point where it might as well be a almost solid. Bending bias again is something that I'm more cautious with. As you can see, as I've increased that, it's becoming even stiffer. So if I put them all to 100, it's almost like a very, very large leather sheet, which is hardly bending at all. Whereas if we come right down, it's going to be a much more kind of fluid, much more malleable kind of material. Again, I would caution against maximum or minimum values, tendency to go a bit nuts. I would keep the weft and the warp close together, don't have to be exact, but I would leave any adjustments in the bias to very small values, because even if I have kind of small values on the, or smaller values on the warp and weft, if I go to a higher value on the bias, it's going to stiffen overall. So I would keep those low, or at least keep those changes minor. There we go. So I hope that made sense. In the next one we'll start to have a look at these buckling properties and see how they work. Okay, so I'll talk to you then. Okay, so let's reset the material. Let's drag and drop that over there. There we go, that didn't change much. So now we're going to have a look at the buckling. So we've got sort of two sections here. We've got the buckling ratio and the buckling stiffness. Now the buckling stiffness I haven't had much basically effect with. I just can't see what it's doing. It's meant to be working on the corners, but even then I haven't been able to reproduce a simulation that demonstrates it sensibly. So it's something I don't really use at all. Whereas the buckling ratio is basically how much force is required to make your material buckle. And if I have a quick look at my cheat sheet, I've got the buckling ratio here is the force needed to bend in the horizontal for weft, vertical for warp, and on the bias for the ratio bias, of course. Now lower values bend less and higher values bend more. So this is kind of opposite the way around to the first sets we've done. I'd preferred they'd done that the other way around personally, make it consistent, but well, there you go. So let's have a look, see what this does. So for this default material, everything's set to 0. So this is at its lowest. So if I increase the buckling ratio, you might find that nothing happens, because it's not actually buckling much in the horizontal anyway, or that's the vertical rather. So let's do the horizontal. There we go, nothing much happening. And let's try the warp, the vertical. Nothing much happening. And then the bias. And again, oops, make sure it's actually simming. That seems to have actually done something. So let me remove that. And that I may not have had the sim running. Foolish man. Let me reset it and then start again. Right, so the sim's running. So buckling ratio warp, no, buckling ratio weft. Let's increase that. And I'm keeping an eye on my sim see if it's actually doing an awful lot, and it doesn't seem to be. And the warp does. Now the warp is doing it essentially because it's buckling more in the vertical anyway, so allowing it to buckle even more is having more of an effect, whereas when we did the left to right one, there wasn't much buckling going on in the first place, so it's had very little effect. Okay, so let's pop that back to 0, and then I'll pop that back to 0 because it's not doing anything. But the bias, if I increase that across the X, basically the diagonal bias, it's actually not doing anything. So it really depends upon how your garment or your cloth is draping. You know, if it's not draping, you know, much in any particular direction, and is not buckling in any particular direction, adjusting it's going to make no difference. Now I had read or something or other that both of these are far more useful for things like blankets and tables and not tables, don't simulate tables, tablecloths, towels and such like, because you can get better folds, you get better drapes over the edges as it drapes over the edge of a bed or over the end of a table and such like. So I don't use either of them very often. I use this one even less, the stiffness, because I can't get it to do anything anyway. But generally speaking, when I'm using the buckling ratios, it's because I'm doing like a curtain, or I'm doing a tablecloth, or I'm, you know, making a bed with a quilt and pillows and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so I hope that was useful. In the next bit we'll have a look at these last three, and then we'll be done. So I'll talk to you then. Okay, so excuse me, there's not much show really for me on internal damping, because in general it's used for animation. So, you know, when your avatar is moving or walking, you know, and hitting your cloth and it's moving, if you increase the internal damping, the garment will move slower, and if you reduce it, it will move faster. So it will help to simulate, you know, maybe you've got a dress with a very heavy skirt, then you increase the internal damping, because, you know, as the avatar walks, it's going to be the cloth is going to react much slower. Whereas if you were wearing a, you know, say a very light sort of, I don't know, taffeta, silky kind of garment, you might want it to move faster, so you reduce the internal damping. Now density is basically how much it reacts to gravity. So how dense is your material. If we go back to the properties here, I'll just reset this. There we go, and select the properties. So density is set at 27. I believe that's grams per square meter. I could be wrong. It's not per square inch, that would be crazy. So if you make this a very low value, it's going to be a very light material. It's neither going to, you know, pull to the ground very easily, because it's light. Gravity's not going to have that much effect on it, but it's also not going to have much effect on itself. So, you know, where it's being pulled and draped, because, you know, I've suspended a couple of points up in the air, it's not reacting very much because there's not as much gravity pulling on that, on those bits of garment. Whereas if I raise this up much higher, you'll see that it reacts far more to gravity. You'll see it's really draping, it's really pulling against itself, because, you know, it's much heavier. You know, it's reaching the ground. We've got, you know, really stretched bits up here. So it can be really useful to, you know, amend how things are working. And, you know, I've used it in sort of skirts essentially. You know, if I want a much heavier skirt, then I increase the intensity, and it will pull the skirt down much further, and, you know, give me a really nice drape. Whereas if I'm doing something like something much lighter and fluffier, like I don't know, a tutu or a taffeta skirt or something, then I don't want it to do that. I don't want it to pull against itself and drape. I want it to be much lighter, so you reduce the density. Okay, so I think I've waffled on enough about that. So the last one I'm going to have a look at then is the friction. So the friction is how much friction is there between this particular garment and the things around it. So in this case the avatar, and for this I'm going to actually get a proper avatar in. So let's go to the avatars, and I'm in the wrong place entirely. Let's pull the male in. There we go. Come on, you can load. It's not that hard. There we go. So let me just draw a small strip around about his shoulder area. And I'm going to drape this over his shoulder. Just press F to focus on that strip. There we go. I'm going to move it quite close to his neck. And then in the fabrics, I'll apply that default to it just to make sure. There we go. Now if I drape that, you'll see it drapes to him and it slips down his shoulder, and the friction on this one is set to 3. So let me press Ctrl Z to reset that. That's 3 times for me there. Now if I increase the friction much higher, you'll see that it stays high on his shoulder, because there's it takes more energy for it to slip than not, than to stay where it is. And if I then take that and reduce the friction, whoops, there we go. See, I can now pull this wherever I want and it will slip off. Perhaps a better demonstration is if I undo this a few times. Come on, go back on his shoulder. There we go. If I select the material and if I turn the friction right down, we should get an instance here where there's virtually no friction between the avatar and the cloth, so it's just slipping off him. So even kind of for this one, minor changes in this can stop your garment slipping off your avatar. If you've got some shoulder straps, say, that are continually falling down shoulders, then you can increase the friction on that particular material, probably not by very much, and it will stay where it is. Obviously, not obviously, sorry, it's best for that strip to be quite well fitting. If it's a very small strip which is stretched right over and is being pulled all over the place, you may not have any luck. But if it's fitting nicely and is just slipping, then increasing friction could do you some good. So yes, I hope you found that useful. Quite often I'll pick one of these materials and then tweak it a little bit to get it to do or behave a little bit more how I want it to behave. And I know a lot of people are clever enough to put whole presets together and save them, but I'm not that clever, I don't think. But I hope you find it useful. I hope it makes things perhaps a little bit clearer and gives you some tips or on what to do if you're having trouble with your garment. Again, any comments below, any questions, put them in the comments. If you learned something, hit like, that would be lovely, or subscribe, anything you like really. Rightio, I'll talk to you soon.